Welcome to This Old Road. This is episode 4 in my series on California's Great Renumbering of 1964. The 17 different U.S. highway route numbers which existed in the Golden State in 1963 were reduced to only 7 after the process was all said and done, and even some of the routes which remain were substantially shortened and altered. In the first episode in the series, I laid out the rationale for the Great Renumbering, and then in episode number 2, I covered the 5 routes which were eliminated completely, plus a bonus route which had been removed 30 years before the Great Renumbering. In the most recent installment, episode number 3, I showed you the 4 routes which were truncated, that's highway speak for shortened, and in today's video I'm going to cover the routes which live on today as legacy routes, state highway routes carrying numbers that descend directly from their original U.S. highway route numbers. Now there were 5 such routes that fit here: US 60, US 66, US 91, US 99, and US 299. But in this episode I'm going to discuss only 4 of them. If you've been waiting for US 99, I'm going to disappoint you because I'm not going to include it in this video. I've decided to hold it for the next video because I really want to give it the treatment that it deserves. The length and complexity of US 99 and its history proved to be just too much to try and squeeze all of those details into this episode. I believe that US 99 was probably the most important of all the US highways in California, and as a kid who grew up in the San Joaquin Valley, Highway 99 is near and dear to my heart. So don't be glum, US 99 will be coming next time. One of the interesting aspects of this group of routes is that 3 of them actually picked up new mileage during the Great Renumbering. To be sure, nearly all of them were truncated to shorter lengths first, but these 3 were then extended to places where they had never gone before when they were U.S. highways. When you see the details, you may quibble with at least one of them, but I'll revisit that in a few minutes and you can rebut me in the comments. Okay, let me get started with US 91. The primary job of US 91 in California was to provide the connection between Las Vegas and Southern California. Prior to 1964, US 91 crossed the state line about 40 miles south of Las Vegas at precisely the same location where Interstate 15 enters California today, and then it passed through Baker and Barstow, over Cajon Pass, down through San Bernardino and Riverside and the Santa Ana Canyon, and finally through Anaheim to end in Long Beach. Along the way, US 91 shared the pavement with at least one other route virtually all the way from the state line down to Riverside. First was its 110-mile concurrency with US 466 from the Nevada state line to Barstow. In Barstow, the overlay with US 466 ended, but US 91 picked up a shared routing with US 66. However, because US 66 and 466 did not actually meet in Barstow, technically there was a short 2-mile stretch on the north end of Barstow where US 91 was the sole route as it transitioned between its concurrencies with those other 2 routes. But after Barstow, US 91 and US 66 were together for the entire 75 miles down into San Bernardino. In addition, for the final 30 miles of that jaunt to San Bernardino, US 395 joined the party too, resulting in a triple concurrency over Cajon Pass. In San Bernardino, US 66 broke away from US 91, and US 395 followed suit in Riverside, which then left US 91 as the only designation on its final segment, the 57 miles from Riverside to where it ended in Long Beach. In the last episode, I took a pretty exhaustive exploration into the location of the end of US 6 and US 91, so I won't repeat it here, but it's interesting and certainly quirky, so I would encourage you to check out episode 3 for all of those sordid details. If you don't want to watch the entire video, you can use the chapters to jump directly to the commentary about US 6. In the Great Renumbering, the primary replacement for US 91 would become Interstate 15, all the way from the state line down to where it met Interstate 10 in Colton. At the time of the Great Renumbering, the intention was that Interstate 15 would end at Interstate 10, so south of that interchange it would be US 395, which would carry on between Interstate 10 and Riverside. However, south of or west of Riverside, US 91 was the only US route on the corridor. Truncating US 91 so that that segment could be retained as US 91 was not an option, because doing that would have severed it from the remainder of US 91 in other states. US 91 couldn't be left in place between Riverside and Long Beach if it didn't connect with US 91 in Nevada. Thus, it would be necessary to find a new number. Through Santa Ana Canyon, like in so many other of these circumstances, there was a second numbered state route which was also assigned to the highway along with US 91. In this case, it was State Route 18. That means that they could have opted just to remove the US 91 shields and just call it Route 18, but I like the solution that they chose much better. Because even though US 91 was also State Route 18, and there were even bare route shields with the number 18 all along the route, and even though the road had been Route 18 even before it became US 91 after World War II, by the 1960s the general public knew it as Highway 91. So even with all of these factors which could have tilted the scale toward just redesignating it as State Route 18, the planners of the Great Renumbering instead decided to allow Highway 91 to keep its number. They just changed its designation from U.S. Highway to State Highway. With that decision, the history of the number 91 and the heritage of the route could be retained, and motorists wouldn't have to be bothered by yet another numbering change. Perhaps as a consolation for 91's downgrade in prestige, Route 91 even got extended by another 12 miles, which placed its new end in Manhattan Beach instead of Long Beach. Now, I said that Highway 91 was extended by 12 miles, but a compelling case could have been made that all of the mileage on the 91 freeway, which is west of the point where it emerges from the Santa Ana Canyon, represented new mileage on the route. There's no disputing that State Route 91 represented a direct replacement of US 91 through Riverside and Corona and the Santa Ana Canyon. But west of Anaheim, the 91 freeway runs about 2 to 4 miles north of the historical alignment of US 91. In fact, in some respects, rather than as a replacement for US 91, the 91 freeway could be viewed more as a replacement for State Route 14, which ran along the Artesia Boulevard corridor prior to the Great Renumbering. I can see both sides of this debate, but I still come down to believing that the 91 freeway replaced US 91 all the way to the Long Beach Freeway, because that would be the same distance west as the end of the old US 91 in Long Beach. However, west of the Long Beach Freeway, there's no doubt that State Route 91 certainly represents new or extended mileage over old US 91. The 91 freeway was constructed only as far as the Long Beach Freeway in the early 1970s. West of that, State Route 91 followed Artesia Boulevard, which again had been the location of State Route 14. That circumstance remained as a status quo for nearly 2 decades until the 91 freeway finally was extended to the 110. But beyond that, even today, 91 is a surface route through Torrance and out to its end at Pacific Coast Highway. So with these things in mind, I'll make the case that the western end of Route 91 was extended by just 12 miles in 1964. But this analysis brings me to another point. Did you notice that I said the western end? But wait, wasn't US 91 a north and south route? Well, yes it was, but here's the interesting thing. In those sections of US 91 which were preserved as State Route 91, the road had trended primarily in an east-west direction. The Great Renumbering offered an opportunity for the Division of Highways to correct that directional confusion by officially signing the route as east and west. After all, those rules about directions and odd versus even numbered routes apply only to interstates and U.S. highways, not to state routes. So the planners of the Great Renumbering didn't hesitate to make the change, and what had previously been North and South US 91 became East and West State Route 91. Interestingly, State Route 91 was not the only route to be given a new directional orientation in the Great Renumbering. Consider US 6, which is an east-west highway nationally, but its routing in California was almost exclusively north and south. In fact, the case of misdirection for US 6 was even more stark than that of US 91, because US 6 entered the state at 118 degrees west longitude, and its end in Long Beach was also located at 118 west longitude, virtually perfectly north and south. And to be more precise, its western end was even a fraction of a degree east of that initial longitude. So the major replacements for US 6, both state routes 14 and 11, were designated as north and south routes. I missed that detail when I covered US 6 in the last episode, so I'm grateful to the commenter who pointed that out for me. Some of you have really provided great insights into these discussions in the comments, so keep those comments coming because I learn more every single day. And speaking of directional misorientation, there's a similar quirk along US 101 in Southern California from Studio City all the way out to Gaviota, because even though US 101 is a north and south highway, it trends overwhelmingly east and west for a distance of about 120 miles. Through the years, this directional dissonance has caused confusion and inconsistent signage, especially along the Ventura Freeway in the San Fernando Valley, where the signs sometimes say east and west and other times show it as north and south. Unfortunately, this one couldn't be corrected in the Great Renumbering because US 101 was not truncated that far north. So Caltrans and the motoring public have been left with no option but to deal with it for the last 6 decades. But that's enough of a diversion. Back to Route 91. Along the new State Route 91, what had been northbound US 91 became eastbound State Route 91, and the prior southbound US 91 became westbound State Route 91. So to summarize the complete impact of the Great Renumbering on US 91, Route 91 lost 190 of its miles, retained 57 miles, was extended by 12 miles, and had its directional orientation changed by 90 degrees. If you're tired of the amount of AI drivel that has swamped YouTube lately, you can let YouTube know by clicking the thumbs up on this video. The videos on this channel are written by me and crafted by hand, warts and all, and your likes help the YouTube algorithm decide which videos to share with other people who like these sort of topics. I'll appreciate your support, and your fellow viewers that you save from clicking on unremarkable AI content will appreciate you too. Thanks. And now, on to US 299. US 299 was the simplest of the 4 routes in this video, but it's also the route for which I was able to find the fewest number of historic photos. I suppose that's due to the fact it was primarily a rural route that passed through mostly remote areas of the state. The routing of US 299 was across Northern California, connecting from US 101 in Arcata to US 395 at Alturas. In between them, about midway on the route, was Redding, which is by far the largest city on the entire highway. Redding was where US 299 met its parent route, US 99, and those 2 routes shared a short 2-mile concurrency on the north side of town. Like its sibling US 399, US 299 was another of those routes which never left the state, and it was being eliminated because its parent route, US 99, was being eliminated. Since US 299 existed only within California, there wasn't any need to coordinate with any other states, so removal of US 299 was pretty straightforward. There were no interstate replacements nor significant concurrencies, so none of the route needed to be truncated, and the architects of the renumbering decided just to keep the same number on the whole thing. So the Great Renumbering really was just a matter of swapping out the shields. The conversion of Highway 299 caused minimal impact on motorists. The Great Renumbering left that short concurrency in Redding in place, and it remains even today. The only difference now is that the old routing of US 99 in that area is now State Route 273. But there was one change for Route 299 in 1964. The planners actually added mileage to the route in the Great Renumbering. Prior to the renumbering, the eastern end of US 299 had been at its junction with US 395 in Alturas, but the Great Renumbering ended up tacking on an additional 35 miles so that Highway 299 would extend all the way to the state line. That new segment of road that was being assigned to Highway 299 was already officially a state highway which passed through the remote Modoc County town of Cedarville. The road was a part of Legislative Route 28, but to my knowledge it did not have a publicly facing route number, and if it did, I've never run across it on any map that showed it. If any of you Modoc County folks are aware of a number that may have been present on this route through Cedarville, please share it with me in the comments, but I don't think that it did. So in this case, the Great Renumbering provided an opportunity to assign a number for a state highway that didn't have a route number, and it became a part of State Route 299. To be clear, there never was a US 299 in Nevada, nor was there ever a plan to create one. This California highway is a little odd because the road to which State Route 299 connects was a dirt road on the Nevada side of the state line in 1964, and it was called Nevada State Route 8A at the time. These days, some 60 years later, that road on the Nevada side still is not paved, but Nevada removed that road from its state highway network during their own Great Renumbering back in 1980. So now, California State Route 299 ends at the state line and connects to a local road which Washoe County maintains and calls Highway 8A. There's another peculiarity to note about this. That road to Cedarville on which Highway 299 was routed does not meet US 395 at the same place where US 299 connects to US 395 in Alturas as it comes in from the west. The turnoff to Cedarville is about 6 miles north of Alturas, so the routing of Highway 299 has to jog northward with US 395 in order to connect the two pieces and make it a contiguous route. Thus, in this case, this extension of US 299 ended up creating a brand new concurrency. Recall that one of the primary purposes of the Great Renumbering had been to eliminate dual-numbered routes, but this was a rare case where the Great Renumbering actually created a new concurrency which had not existed previously. Finally, there is one more concurrency of note along State Route 299. I didn't include it on the diagram because it's a state route, and on these schematics I've been sticking to the routes which were US routes prior to 1964, but there was a pretty significant shared routing with State Route 139, extending for 22 miles between Ayden and Canby. Given the low traffic volumes and the lack of alternatives in this remote part of the state, the planners just left this concurrency in place. In the end, in the conversion from US highway to state route, US Highway 299 lost none of its 285 miles and ended up gaining an additional 35 miles in the 1964 renumbering. And now I'll move ahead to the third of the routes with legacy numbers, US 60. This is the gargantuan Kellogg interchange along the San Bernardino Freeway near Pomona. But would you believe that all three of these photos were taken in virtually the same place? This idyllic junction on the west side of Pomona was all that was necessary to meet the traffic demands in the years after World War II. This corner marked the western end of the split between US 60 and the concurrent routes US 70 and 99. The three routes had split apart 50 miles to the east in Beaumont and followed two different routings through the Inland Empire. The combined US 70 and 99 followed a more northerly path near San Bernardino, while US 60 passed through Riverside. It was here, at this corner, that the routes came back together for the final 30 miles into Los Angeles. By the end of the 1950s, this interchange had been upgraded to a freeway-style interchange with a flyover ramp for westbound US 60 traffic, but as you can see, the profile of the junction was still comparatively small. And then came this behemoth, freeways radiating outward in 5 different directions as Interstate 10 along with State Routes 57 and 71 all meet at a single point. I focus on this interchange because of its significance in the history of Route 60. West of this interchange, US 60 was being replaced by Interstate 10 and wouldn't be needed at all. But east of here, through Pomona, Ontario, Riverside, and out to Beaumont, US 60 was the sole route on the road. And then beyond Beaumont, US 60 was again being replaced by Interstate 10. So while US 60 was being replaced on each end, here in this center section it wasn't being replaced. Yet it could not retain its identity as US 60 because it would be severed from the rest of US 60 in Arizona. A new number would be needed, and this became another instance where the planners decided to keep the number, 60, but instead change it to a state route. However, in 1964, like so many of the other new interstate freeways, Interstate 10 wasn't completely ready, and so US 60 still would be needed out in the desert until the freeway could be completed between Indio and Blythe. So, since US 60 was still needed out there, it remained connected to Arizona and there was no hurry to change the signs in Riverside. The last time that US 60 was still on the official state map was in 1967. After that, it was just Interstate 10 in the desert and then State Route 60 through Riverside. But now I come back to this western section, and specifically, I wonder about the Pomona Freeway. Today, it's a part of State Route 60, but should that be viewed as a replacement for US 60, or did this represent new mileage added to US 60? I've gone back and forth on this question several times, but at least at the time I'm making this video, I tend to come down to the premise that the Pomona Freeway represents new mileage for Route 60. But who knows, maybe I'll change my mind again later. It was Interstate 10 which replaced US 60 west of this junction. In fact, significant portions of the San Bernardino Freeway already had been constructed by the time of the Great Renumbering, and US 60 was being routed along that freeway. So it was the San Bernardino Freeway which represented US 60 and was the replacement for US 60. None of the Pomona Freeway had been built by 1963. It shows up as a proposed freeway on the official state map, but unfortunately, that map doesn't show any number for the route other than that it was legislative route number 172. Maybe, if there had never been a great renumbering, then US 60 might have eventually been moved down to the Pomona Freeway, and maybe there was even a long-range plan to do just that, but I've never run across any map that indicates that. So, I contend that State Route 60 replaced US 60 only between Beaumont and Pomona, and all of the miles west of Pomona represent new miles. If you see it differently, I can understand those arguments too, so I'd love to see your disagreements in the comments. To summarize, in the Great Renumbering, US 60 lost 175 of the 225 miles that it had in 1963, and it retained 50 as a converted state route, and then gained an additional 25 miles. And now, US 66. I'll close this episode with the route which really spawned the fad of tracing old routes for so many people, US 66. The final nail in the coffin for US 66 was driven next door in Arizona when that number was moved from a section of the old highway in Seligman after Interstate 40 was completed in 1984, and then US 66 was officially no longer an active highway. But the beginning of the end for Route 66 came in the California Great Renumbering 2 decades earlier. Just like in Arizona, Interstate 40 was coming to California, and it would be replacing that historic route. Today, there's a romantic lore associated with US 66, and some people consider the historic route to be the ultimate road trip as they try to reconnect with a bygone era. But US 66 was a part of popular culture long before it faded from the map. John Steinbeck treated US 66 like another character in the story when he wrote The Grapes of Wrath. He called US 66 the Mother Road and devoted several chapters to the highway. US 66 was the subject of popular songs and TV shows, too. But none of that fame and mythology could spare America's Main Street from the Great Renumbering. In California, the routing for US 66 entered the state by crossing over the Colorado River on a historic early century bridge near Topac, Arizona. Even before the highway could get to the edge of Needles, US 66 picked up a concurrency with US 95. Those two routes ran through town together and then split about a dozen miles west of town. On this diagram, I'm calling that junction Goffs, but only because there's not really another name for this junction. The town of Goffs is actually a little further up the road from this split. Then came one of the more famous sections of US 66, the 143 miles across the Mojave Desert until it met up with US 91 in Barstow. Beyond Barstow, it was 75 miles across the high desert over Cajon Pass and down into San Bernardino. The final 30 miles of that concurrency between US 66 and 91 also were shared with US 395 too. From San Bernardino, US 66 left those concurrent routes and headed due west, connecting all of the foothill communities for 50 miles across to Pasadena. In Pasadena, US 66 was routed down to Los Angeles along the Pasadena Freeway, which it had used since the Arroyo Seco Parkway opened in 1940. The official maps indicate that Figueroa Street, the routing which had been used for US 66 prior to the Arroyo Seco Parkway, remained signed as alternate US 66 right up until the Great Renumbering, but mainline US 66 used the freeway routing. At Elysian Park, US 6 joined with US 66 up to the stack. Up until just prior to the 1964 renumbering, US 99 also had been a party to this concurrency. At the stack, US 66 switched freeways and joined with US 101 toward Hollywood. At Santa Monica Boulevard, US 66 exited the Hollywood Freeway and broke away from US 101 for the final portion of its routing, on which it was the sole route westward to Santa Monica. Now, despite the lore these days, the western end of US 66 was not on nor at the Santa Monica Pier. This sign was installed only to boost tourism. The reality is that US 66 didn't even make it to within sight of the Pacific Ocean. In 1963, the western end of US 66 was at the corner of Lincoln and Olympic in Santa Monica, where US 66 met up with alternate US 101. To be sure, the endpoint of US 66 was located at various different points all over LA and Pasadena at one time or another over the years, and that history is beyond the scope of this video. But one place that certainly was never the end of US 66 is the Santa Monica Pier. With all of this complexity, there were essentially three sections of road where US 66 was the sole number on a roadway. Out here in the desert from Needles to Barstow, along the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains, from San Bernardino through Pasadena and to the edge of Elysian Park, and then across West LA from Hollywood to Santa Monica. The easternmost section of US 66, from the Arizona state line all the way into Barstow, was replaced by Interstate 40. That freeway was constructed on a new alignment, which is as many as a dozen miles north of the old road. The freeway's routing saved about 10 miles between the Colorado River and Barstow, but it was not completed until the early 1970s. That delay in completion provided a temporary reprieve for US 66 because US 66 signage remained in place along the old highway for 8 more years after the Great Renumbering until the freeway opened. Today, that bypass section of old US 66 is one of the most popular stretches for modern-day Route 66 road trippers to explore. And in more recent years, San Bernardino County has maintained the heritage of the road by designating it as County Route 66. After the Great Renumbering, the concurrency with US 95 near Needles remained intact even after Interstate 40 was completed, although the dual routing now is about 12 miles shorter than the concurrency had been prior to 1964, owing to the freeway's newer alignment. The signage for the concurrency in Needles is haphazard at best, and in some places it looks like an afterthought. To say the least, it's not Caltrans' best signage effort. Between Barstow and San Bernardino, those three concurrent routes, US 66, 91, and 395, all were eventually absorbed into Interstate 15, although it took a little longer for US 395. And then came the next standalone section of US 66, about 55 miles, across to Pasadena and then southward along what was, at the time, called the Pasadena Freeway. The Pasadena Freeway just became State Route 11. I believe that State Route 11 still had been routed along with alternate Route 66 before 1964, so this change meant that they moved State Route 11 from the surface streets and onto the freeway. On the Hollywood Freeway, they were able to remove US 66 easily enough and just leave the freeway as US 101, which it still is today. And that final section between Hollywood and Santa Monica just became State Route 2. Now I'll turn to this middle section of the three portions where US 66 ran without concurrency with any other routes. This stretch between San Bernardino and Elysian Park. That middle portion was carved into three major sections, and I'll warn you that this piece is going to get complicated. The first of the three slices is the portion which retained the number 66, and it went westward from the junction of the US 91-395 freeway, the same freeway which was becoming Interstate 15 in 1964. But remember, in 1964, the routing for Interstate 15 ran right through San Bernardino. So the freeway that I'm referencing is not the one where modern-day I-15 is located. Instead, it's where Interstate 215 is today. As you can see, this is already getting confusing very quickly. The route for US 66 westward from San Bernardino was essentially Foothill Boulevard for the 29 long miles until it met with State Route 30 in San Dimas. That would be where the corner of Foothill Boulevard and Baseline Road is in San Dimas today. The Great Renumbering defined that point as the official western end of the new State Route 66. West of that corner, the middle slice of this section, which had been the remainder of old US 66 into Pasadena, became State Route 248. And then that third slice I already mentioned, it was the Pasadena Freeway, which became State Route 11. So that was the official plan, divided into three portions: State Route 66, brand new State Route 248, and then State Route 11. But in reality, that reprieve for US 66 while work continued on Interstate 40 in the desert meant that the signs for US 66 remained in place all the way to Pasadena until 1972. So this part here, the official State Route 66, and this part here, that part that was defined as new State Route 248, both those parts kept their US 66 shields for 8 more years. Now the part that was called State Route 248 was really a placeholder route number anyway, because the long-range goal was to build the Foothill Freeway and then extend the 210 route number over that section and eliminate 248. I don't think there was ever a single sign posted anywhere for Route 248. From what I can discern from my research of the maps, the only signs which ever appeared on Route 248 were shields for US 66. Ultimately, the Foothill Freeway was completed, and that whole part just became a part of Interstate 210. Now, back to this final section again, the first of the three slices. Because even though 29 miles of the old Mother Road had managed to hold on to the cherished number 66, the state of California has continued to chip away at it through the years. At present, a number of pieces of that have been relinquished to various municipalities, resulting in a non-continuous route. Technically, Route 66 no longer exists through the cities of Claremont, Upland, Rancho Cucamonga, Fontana, and Rialto. And even along those sections of State Route 66 which still are maintained by the state, signage for Route 66 is very sparse. But strictly speaking, from the perspective of the Great Renumbering, Route 66 was divvied up and replaced by these routes. From east to west, 40, 15, 66, 248, 11, 101, and 2. After all of the moves from the Great Renumbering had been completed, US 66, which had boasted a length of 313 miles in 1963, lost 286 of those miles and retained only 29. And in the decades since, many of those 29 miles have been lost too. So this concludes my look at the US routes which were converted to state routes, well, 4 of them anyway, routes that I like to call heritage route numbers or legacy route numbers. In the next episode, I'll cover the remaining one, US 99, so please look for that. If this video was something that you enjoyed, I'd ask you to click the like button, because that's one of the ways that YouTube decides if it should show the video to more people. Please let them know that you approve. And as always, if you enjoy the content on this old road, I'd be honored to have you as a subscriber.